Hello, my name's Jason. I'm not an archaeologist, but I do play one on TV. So come join me as we go into the dust. All right, for the first few interviews in my interview series, I was speaking to my classmates at UCL. Now, why I chose these particular classmates is we are all mature students. As I say in the interviews, that's not any kind of judgment on our characters. It means we're old. After all, my journey was about getting inspired to study archaeology when I was in the middle of my career. Um, I go into that in episode 0, so I won't elaborate here. But I do want to show people how some folks in the height of their careers also made this decision and what they decided to do. Now, the first interview was with David Ingram, one of my classmates who was actually taking a bachelor's. He and I talk about some of the ways in which he got involved in archaeology as a second career, some of the challenges and benefits of that, of going back to school at his age, some of how the archaeologists interact with the public and the issues around that. We discuss Graham Hancock of ancient apocalypse fame, or you could say infamy, and why the archaeologists hate him. Now, I have to say that my podcast is in no way sponsored or sanctioned by UCL's Institute of Archaeology, but we also discuss some of the great professors we have there that are doing some really exciting stuff. So that's a bit of my conversation with David. Hope you enjoy. And for those of you who are considering getting involved in archaeology at a more advanced age, I hope this gives you some hope. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the very first interview in this Into the Dust Archaeology series. This first sets of interviews, I'm actually interviewing my classmates. There's a bunch of us at UCL here, the University College London, who are mature students. That's not so much of a judgment on our character, more just like we're older. And we all have very, very different backgrounds. So there are those of us who are, there's someone into fashion, there's someone into morbid death kind of stuff who's a musician, there's me, I'm a business guy. Today we have someone who originally started out as a doctor. We'll hear more about that. Our guest today is David Ingram. He'll give you his background, but just in terms of why I thought he might be an interesting character to have as interview number 1. I took a public archaeology course with him, and that's actually where you get into some of the controversies and things that break out into the news, the part where it's not just the archaeologists in their holes digging. Now, whenever David spoke, people just sort of quieted. You'll hear from his voice. If I had his voice, I might be like a real podcaster. But sort of imagine the male version of Judi Dench giving that narration at the beginning of the movie. That's what you're going to hear, hopefully 40 minutes of, or 30, a lot more of him than me. So without further ado, David Ingram.
Well, thank you, Jason. A delightful description of my dulcet tones. So yes, as you said, we took a class together, and several classes, I think, actually, and we also ran into each other on a dig over in Dorset, I think, earlier this year. So you sent me a few questions, and I thought I'd obviously looked at them, and you wanted to understand a little bit about my background.
Yeah, first tell us just a bit about yourself. What did you do before coming to UCL?
Okay, well, I mean, I'll start, actually. The first time I came to UCL, which was back in 1993.
Okay.
So I spent 5 years at UCL Medical School, which is now much larger than it was and has a shiny new hospital. I spent 5 years at UCL Medical School, qualifying as a medical bachelor of surgery as a doctor. But I never practiced. I found in my clinical years that being surrounded by a lot of very sick people actually was rather inimical to my own mental health. So I spilled out of university at UCL the first time in about 1998, heavily indebted. That's probably not as much as today's students, I must say, but at the time it was quite a terrifying kind of multi-10,000-pound debt, and looked for a job. So anyway, found a job in public relations, terrible at it. They quite liked me though, so they moved me over to their advertising side. And then I worked for a French company called Havas, At the time, it was Euro RSCG, because advertising agencies are quite well known for having terribly difficult to remember names. It's almost like a challenge they set themselves to make the worst name possible, which no one can remember.
Yeah, so, my mother, actually, she was an advertising lady boss back in the 70s. I don't even think she went to university, and that was very unusual in New York for that time. She doesn't actually remember the name of all of her employers, and then she just started her own business.
It's generally, there are a lot of letters involved, like YNR and VCCP, etc. But nonetheless, I worked for a company called Euro RSCG, which was a fairly complicated, in the healthcare area, because of my healthcare background, and I made reasonable success of it. We worked on health and wellness brands. By the time I was around 25 years old, I finished university at 22. I think I was on the operational board of directors for the UK, and then I moved up into the European side of that. Got married around the age of 28, so that was 2004. I think my wife would kill me if I were to forget that. It's also a password, obviously, for my Amazon account. And then from there, I changed jobs, worked at a few other agencies, went travelling for a year, which probably was driven by an interest in archaeology, which we're going to come on to. We had a book by a gentleman called Graham Hancock, who is anathema to most archaeologists. He's a pseudoarchaeologist, but what his book had was pictures of lovely places like Chichen Itza and the temples in Cambodia and Thailand, etc. So we took this book as our guide for travelling and set off for a year to see as many of Graham Hancock's wonderful treasures as we could, which we managed. Actually, we went around Central America and through Southeast Asia and India. Which is where I'd met my wife in the first place, actually. But anyway, I digress. So we came back from that. Let me think. So that was when I was about 30, I suppose, 31. And I worked at another ad agency as a managing partner in an advertising agency. I was quite a tempestuous and rather difficult employee. And I think I had an inordinate falling out with the management, which led me to storming off the job, throwing my notice in, and as a result started my own agency, because it was probably wisest to, if you've got that kind of temperament, to work for yourself rather than for somebody else.
Well, people in advertising are not normally known for their calmness and discretion.
They're balanced personalities. Yeah. So having decided to, you can tell me about that. I ran an agency for around 10 years. Opened that in 2008, right into the teeth of the financial crisis. Best time to open a small business, to be honest. Just when the point where everyone's looking for big businesses and going, they're very expensive, you can kind of come in and be a little bit more cost effective. Never cheap, but cost effective. This was advertising. So we did that for about 10 years with two partners, who I love very much, Mike and Liz. And we built the business. We built it in the UK and we built it internationally. And then in around 2018, we hit our decade, and it felt ripe to sell it. We'd kind of reached the level of how far we could take a business such as that, and we wanted to go with a larger partner. So we put ourselves up in the market. I was wheeled to the back. I mostly at the time was doing strategy and writing, and in charge of the editorial side of things. And we wheeled Mike, who was our managing director, and our business head to the front, and we got him out selling things. And he sold our business, and we completed the sale in 2000. And in fact, I completed the sale 3 days before the country locked down for COVID in March.
Good timing.
Yes, inexplicably excellent timing, in fact.
You didn't have anything to do with it.
Nothing to do with it. Well, maybe.
Well, because you were a doctor before.
I was, but no, I tried not to be patient zero. I had been out in Switzerland that February, I think, but I don't remember coming home with any particularly nasty coughs, etc. And I'm not sure I'd admit it if I did.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, so just at the point where I stopped working in my business, which had been a kind of 80-hour-a-week commitment, everybody else in the world also came home and sat in their houses. I had the advantage of not having to get onto Zoom, so I'm still not that comfortable with cameras pointing at me and microphones, where everyone else had to get onto Zoom almost immediately, and Teams and all the other awful kind of video conferencing things, and start trying to struggle through doing their jobs from home. So instead, I looked after my 3 children. I have a 16-year-old, Emily, who's doing her GCSEs at the moment, a 13-year-old, Sam, who's mostly doing his hair at the moment, and a 10-year-old who's just all he does is play football, little Thomas, who's an absolute treasure. And so I looked after them a couple of years ago, I suppose now, 2 years ago. I did their homeschooling, etc., kind of maintained their sanity, bought a dog, which is traditional, I think, amongst middle-class people in Britain when locked in one's house. And we walked the dog, and we had our little set of bubbles around us to keep the children sane.
And where are you set up? Where do you live?
Down in Reigate in Surrey.
Okay.
So I live down there because my mother is she's alone. She's down in Sussex, so we're within reach of her. And my wife's parents are also in Sussex.
Got it.
So we kind of located ourselves. We were in London before we travelled, and then we were in Brighton thereafter. And
for those of you who don't know, something I love about this country is a lot of the counties still bear their ancient names, some of them even tracing from before the Romans. So Sussex was one of the original Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, still the same name, the South Saxons. So that is just south of London, for those of you who don't know.
Well, there you go. I grew up there, and I didn't know that.
Well, there you go.
You learn something new. It's one of the wonderful things about coming back to university is you do tend to learn something new every day. So effectively, the children all went back to school, and my wife, she had been working. She's a scientist, and she had been working on the AstraZeneca vaccine, actually.
Okay.
So that was all completed. So she moved from there and took on a senior scientist role at the Francis Crick Institute. And suddenly I was left alone at home, twiddling my thumbs, as it were, with the dog. And so I thought, well, I need to do something. And I was under considerable restrictive covenants from the business I'd sold, so I couldn't do what I used to do. And I had no intention whatsoever of going into medicine, despite having the qualifications. So I thought, I think what I'll do is I'll have a little look at university at a Bachelor's of Arts degree. And I thought about it, and I considered what I'd actually really enjoyed over the course of my life. And I'm 47 years old now, and I've always had an interest in archaeology.
Well, let's get into that, actually. And there's a lot there. You just gave us tons of material for the rest of this conversation and more.
Well, that's just for history.
But it sounds like what got you first interested in archaeology, similar to what got me interested in it, which is travel.
Yes.
So it would be great if you could talk a little bit about how that interest grew or didn't grow and appeared over your life, and then what made you just decide to take the plunge. What was the moment? Well,
I suppose always as a child I found history fascinating. But when you've decided, as it were, to move into something like medicine, what you have to do is you have to leave the arts and humanities behind. Not necessarily now, but back then you did, and you focus on science, maths, etc. And so I suppose the last history I'd done would have been GCSE history back when I was probably 15 years old. And I'd had an enduring love of it, and as you say, it ties very closely into travel. And it was always something, from childhood holidays, etc. I was the one at the archaeology sites and the ruins, and we holidayed a lot in England. Used to go to the hill forts and the castles, and spent a lot of time. And I loved monumental architecture, basically monumental archaeology. That's really what I loved, and that's really what triggered it for me. And so it was then spent most of my 20s. All our holidays were always, generally sunny. I'm not a skier, or if you're going to send me on holiday, send me somewhere where it's a beach. And nearby to quite a lot of nice beaches, some fabulous ruins, both in Europe and beyond. And I suppose I spent a lot of time, kind of, that would always be a part of every holiday I took. So it was a kind of an enduring interest.
Did you realize it at the time? Or is it more in hindsight?
No, I think I knew at the time. I mean, it would have driven decision making in terms of I want to go here because I want to see that, or I want to see this. One of our first holidays in our early 20s, myself and Christy, my wife, was to Egypt to see the pyramids, and she shares the same interest, and she's also a scientist and also has no humanities background. So it was something which we both loved to do. We just loved the history of it. The graffiti, I think, in Egypt was the thing which we loved the most. It's for Roman graffiti, and thousands of years ago, Claudius Wazir was being scrawled into... I can't do it in Latin.
Well, it's a good point. I mean, even from your story, the birth of archaeology as a discipline actually had a lot to do with the beginnings of tourism.
Absolutely, the Grand Tour.
Yeah, exactly. I've written about that. Maybe I'll put that up online. But in any event, they have some of the first evidence of tourism in Egypt in some of that ancient writing. where it would say, you know, I don't know what the ancient Egypt names sound like. Imhotep came here west of Giza to see the pyramids and what they looked like.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's more. We're closer to Cleopatra than she was to the builders of the pyramids.
Yep.
And I think that was part of a. You know, these were kind of. They always have this kind of this draw for people. These monumental structures. The mystery of how they were made, who made them, why they were made, and it's I think it's always fascinated human beings. Actually, there's a true. It's one of the most important elements of archaeology, I'd say, is that it taps into a very visceral kind of need in people to understand the history and their history, and also a fundamental interest in the mystery. And uncovering the mystery. I think there's also, to a certain extent, there's an element of the Indiana Jones about it all too. It's like the secrets and the treasure and etc. etc. And I think that's always been something which has kind of I've had in the back of my mind, let's say. I know it's somewhat kind of frowned upon and looked down upon by the professional archaeology community, but it doesn't stop the fact that these are incredibly popular concepts and narratives, purely because they tap into something very atavistic amongst in terms of human beings, something which we do all love, and you can see that with the growth of metal detecting, etc. Everyone loves a bit of treasure hunting, etc. So archaeology was well, I mean, it's not just that it was very high in my list as kind of anthropology, archaeology. Went through all the things of A, couldn't do astronomy, but I chose archaeology just because it was something I'd always been interested in. I thought it would be a really interesting thing to study, and I wanted to do a bachelor's in art degree because I enjoy writing. I did it professionally for many years, but in a rather select, churning out 30 words of copy for a cross-tracks ad, or writing a 25-second video script, etc. A rather specific type of writing, and I wanted to try my hand at a different type of writing. And that's something which actually studying at UCL has really allowed me to fulfill. It's really helped my writing. I think I've, like many people, have ambitions one day to write my grand opus and write a book. Mine's more likely to be about spies and CIA people who've lost their jobs and that kind of thing.
Oh, we should talk. That was my first career, so yeah.
Well, excellent. So I would imagine I'm more in the trash fiction space, but nonetheless. I've always had kind of. I retain an ambition to write a book one day, and I thought this was an excellent opportunity to be put in an environment in which you were forced to write, and had to write in different styles. And I think that's something again which UCL has kind of delivered within the archaeology course. So broadly from the area, I was always interested in it. Travel was part of it, seeing the world and seeing the wonderful things which human beings have built around the world.
Now, your wife is at Francis Crick. That's
not anymore. She's moved to the Institute of Cancer Research.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I was just going to introduce. That's a very serious place. They do a lot of genetic studies. It's a few blocks from here.
Yep.
I was just there a couple of weeks ago because ancient DNA, that has to do with my research area. Probably I'm doing my PhD in something to do with that. If I ever get there, we'll see.
Okay, with the labs you were in, probably the glass-walled labs, she was working directly opposite. The glass-walled lab, the other side. And her interest is, her area of study, she's a microbiologist with a specialty in virology.
Got it.
But she's been working in using viruses as mechanisms by which anti-cancer drugs can be delivered.
Got it.
And that's why she now works at the Institute of Cancer Research. So it's more genomics and that side of things, but tied into it.
Yeah, understood. Now, so she's got a serious job, and you're not an empty nester. You have three.
I have three
kids still at home.
Yes,
so what made you just take that plunge to be like, now I'm going to study?
Well, I think this was part of a trade, actually. I mean, I had worked in my own business, which is extraordinarily labour intensive and sucks up an awful lot of your time. And Christy had been working in a small microbiology testing lab in our hometown in Reigate. And part of the kind of bargain, or however you would describe it, in our marriage, or the agreement in our marriage, was that when and if I ever sold that business, that I would take on a lot more of a childcare, and she would be able to kind of realise her ambitions within her career, which is why in that transitional year she finished off working in, as I say, with the vaccine, etc., and then not really off the back of that, off the back of her excellent CV and her PhD from UCL. Off the back of that, she was able to get a job as a senior scientist at the Francis Crick Institute, which is a superb CV builder, and then used that or leveraged that to get her work in ICR. So she works full time now, and she only ever worked, I suppose, 2.5 days a week while I was running the business.
Got it.
And so we've traded off within our relationship a certain amount of in terms of childcare. And obviously I've got the better side of a deal because my kids are now quite old and can get themselves home from school and a little bit more self-sufficient. I mean, I suppose when we started, young Thomas was about 7, so that's probably that's increasing. It's getting increasingly easier. But yeah, and that was really part of the trade was to do that, and I'm very fortunate. The sale of the business left me fairly financially comfortable.
That's great, because most people's wives would leave them if they just decided to go into archaeology.
Well, yes, this was actually an agreement. No, it's surprising that she managed to stay with me while I was running an advertising agency. It's not the easiest of or most amenable. There's a lot of travel involved.
Yes.
So. But no, that was part of the agreement. So she so far so good. She hasn't actually left me. And I do a lot more time. I have a lot more time with the kids, which is really important. And to be perfectly honest, I mean, doing a BA, a degree, having done medicine, which is a fairly full-time degree, and you do for around 48 weeks a year, this is a lot more amenable to family life. I mean, that's probably because I'm very fortunate. I don't have to have a job on the side. I don't need a side gig. I think if I was working as well, this would never the twain shall meet. At some point, I would have hit an issue with either the children, the degree, or the job. And so I'm in a very fortunate position. I'm very aware of that.
Yeah, and that brings up a certain point for me, which is something that I learned in beginning to study archaeology, and maybe you knew before, or maybe you learned during your time here, which is archaeology is a very tough career. Yes. For those of you who don't know, I think a starting archaeologist in this country in their first year makes like less than £20,000.
Around £18,000.
So, it's very, very rough. Yeah. And so there is a bit of a question of, people go through degrees and have to pay for that and then become an archaeologist. Where do you want this to go? What would you like to do with your archaeology?
Well, I suppose to your point, I mean, it's an interesting challenge, because it's a degree which, yes, as you say, I think it's for the 5th or 6th year running the worst paid graduate job of any degree, irrespective of where you acquire it. I suppose from my perspective, I'm looking potentially at doing a PGCE and moving on and doing maybe 10 years as a teacher. Because I have another career. As I said earlier, I'm 47 years old. I have another career in me. I have the ability and time and interest and energy to have another career. I'd like to do something a little more altruistic than advertising. Medicine wasn't quite what it should have been, but I probably could have done that. But I think teaching might be, and I do enjoy teaching. And it's something I've always done, is train juniors within my own businesses and within other people's businesses. And I enjoy just the general being around young people. It's one of the benefits of coming to university. It's a very positive experience.
So as you pointed out, archaeology is something that may not be the center of your career, but it is something that is a very serious hobby for many people. Yeah. As you mentioned before, we saw each other on a dig. Absolutely. Now, I was there because I had never done a dig before. So I was there for 4 straight weeks. I would have been there for the 5th. But I had a wedding to go to and other things. You were there for just a couple days.
2 weeks. 2 weeks.
2 weeks? Okay.
I was there for 2 weeks.
So you were there for the week that I missed.
I was there the week you weren't there. I saw you first week.
So was that field work connected with your degree, or is that just something you wanted to do?
I didn't need to do it. Okay. I'd done all my food. No, this was actually very much why I do the degree. It's one of the reasons why I would advocate archaeology to anybody. There's 2 sides to archaeology. There's the bookwork. There's the opportunity at somewhere like the Institute of Archaeology to be lectured by leading experts in a field, and in a lot of fields you may never have heard of. Areas of expertise which you hadn't even imagined required experts. And I think that's one of the benefits. And you do your bookwork and you do your essays and you work your way through the winter. And then the thing which makes archaeology probably the best degree retrospectively I could possibly have chosen, is as a social animal, you do digs. And if you're a social animal, you stay with people, you camp with people, the barriers are broken down. You're in the same blood and the same mud, as they'd say in Vietnam films. But you are basically, you're down with everybody else in the same mud, doing the same job, labouring. You can't be precious, and there's no reason to be precious. It's really good fun. It's a really interesting learning opportunity. Your skills are no more developed than anybody else's skills. I mean, I can write when I turned up and I had a reference, etc. A lot of the things I was being taught in the first year in the bookwork side, I already knew how to do. But when it comes to like doing a section drawing or a plan or digging or troweling, etc., I had no idea. I mean, I haven't dug a ditch. Well, I have now. But I hadn't, at that point, dug a ditch, I don't think, since I was about 17 and labouring. And it was absolutely brilliant. I loved it. I did first year, I did the field school, which was 2 weeks, and I would have done another 2 weeks if I could. I did another 2 digs, I think, that summer. Blessing to Christy, who took the kids on, but it's a lot easier during holiday time than it would be during school time. This last year just passed, I was up at Rendlesham digging with Professor Stuart Brooks and Dr. Stuart Brooks actually, and a group of students. I was in Dorset with yourself. I just before I came to this podcast, I was talking to some guys on my year who are looking at organising a dig. Great. And I will be their driver and no doubt help with a little bit of funding. And I think it's just a wonderful part of a degree. It's an essential part of a bachelor's degree. You have to do it. You have to do a certain number of hours, yep. 72. That was cut to 36, but I think over the course of the last 2 years, I've easily done around 70.
I think that's 72 days.
72
right?
days.
Yeah. So it's quite a commitment.
It's a significant commitment. Yeah. When and I think that has to be kind of fit in between April and September, which is the digging season.
Yep.
And it all sounds very wonderful, I suppose, but it's also very expensive in terms of it in itself isn't expensive. You're often camping and you're fed and there's a little stipend which UCL might pay you. But if you've got to take on a job to pay for your fees, to pay for your living expenses during the rest of the year, you can't do both. And I think that's one of the things which is particularly challenging for quite a lot of the younger students, and actually some of the mature students might find that too if they're working with second things. But it's probably the best bit of the whole degree.
Definitely. I mean, I got into archaeology because I wanted to be out in the field, and now I see myself drawn into academia, and I'm still trying to figure it out. I have a very serious back issue right now, which is obviously limiting my participation out there. But anyway, that is often a reason that people do go into archaeology. So what part of archaeology are you interested in most? Do you have a particular culture history area or some kind of functional area? And I would say, like, beyond your just sort of innate interest, which we all have, a lot of academic archaeologists don't want to to admit that, this sort of nerdy interest. Beyond that, what is archaeology, do you think it means to you?
Okay, well, 2 areas, I think, which I'm particularly interested in, I would say. The first is rather prosaic. It's British prehistory. I think I first went to see Stonehenge when I was probably about 7. And back then you could walk up to it and touch it. I mean, you can't even get near it now. But back then you could literally walk up. You used to park up on a verge. You didn't used to pay National Trust. You'd jump over the hedge behind my dad. And we'd walk over and have a walk around the Stonehenge. We'd do it every time we went to Cornwall, actually. It's all fenced in now, obviously. And it's always been fascinating. And I've always enjoyed it. I'm currently in a class with Professor Mike Parker Pearson, and we're doing The Age of Stonehenge, and it's exactly the thing I'm interested in.
Which course is that?
Well, it's one of the modules for BA.
Is it Iron Age Europe or?
No, it's called literally The Age of Stonehenge.
Oh, okay.
That's what it's called. I only have a first lecture this week, and he's a very gently spoken and entertaining, witty man.
And for those of you who don't know, you may recognize him from TV. He'll be one of my guests as well. He's basically Mr. Stonehenge. So
he truly is Mr. Stonehenge. He's got his theories have been well accepted. He's on Channel 4 documentaries. He's found the genesis of where the stones were found. I think it was in a big documentary.
That was last summer, I think.
That's right. Yes, it was. And there's another dig happening later this year, so it's an ongoing project. And he's been working on Stonehenge since I was at university the first time, since 1998, I think. And he's just fascinating. He's got a lovely way of talking and teaching. But also, you're just so privileged to be being taught by somebody of that depth and breadth of knowledge. So that's probably one area I'm particularly interested in. I'm writing my dissertation actually is on rather confusing, something called skeuomorphs, which are a skeuomorph. Let me define a skeuomorph for you. So a skeuomorph is something which looks like something else but does not have its function.
Okay.
So the morph is shape, and skewer, I believe, is something around difference, I think. So, for example, if you had a lighter, if it was shaped like a pistol,
got it,
that would be a skeuomorph.
Yes, and there was a lot of that in British prehistory and in early Middle Ages.
Right around, all over the place. And I found a skeuomorph, you see. So I found a skeuomorph in my first dig. I dug it up. We thought we were digging, well, we were meant to be digging a Tudor. It's a lovely archaeology story. I'll tell you the story. So we were meant to be digging a Tudor hunting lodge, but actually it was on top of a hill. And the nice thing about things when we're on top of a hill is it had a beautiful viewpoint going all the way down the Weald. It was in the Sussex Downs, and you could see right down a dean, a valley down into the Weald. So it's a fabulously defensive spot. And so, unsurprisingly enough, the Romans had also had a camp there because it's a fabulously defensive spot. And then, unsurprisingly, Iron Age man had also thought, good spot here, can see people coming, and so on and so forth, back through Bronze Age, etc. This point literally had just layers, an absolute stratification of history. And I was given a pit to dig, and I think we just thought it was just another Roman grain pit, and it was perfectly round, which is quite rare in pits. I mean, you kind of expect pits to be roundish, but this was a perfectly round pit. When you realise it was perfectly round, someone had actually gone to quite a lot of trouble to put a kind of plaster of chalk, like ground up chalk. They'd put a kind of, God, there's a word for it, but I can't remember what it is. But they'd actually plastered the outside of it, and then they'd got the bottom of it, and they'd plastered back, and then they'd polished it absolutely flat. I only knew this after you'd hunked tons of flints out of it. And right at the bottom, broken in half, was what looks like a quernstone. A quernstone is a grinding stone for corn. But the thing about this quernstone, the thing which made it interesting, was that it was made of chalk, which is effectively about as useful as a chocolate teapot. And you can't grind on chalk, you can't do anything on chalk really. But it was a chalk quernstone, and it had been perfectly broken in half. So right down the middle, and then one end had been flipped up on the other end, and there was nothing else in that pit apart from giant flints. I'm missing. So someone had gone to the trouble of digging this pit, which when you've only got antlers to dig with, it was definitely Iron Age, it was not Roman. When you've only got antlers to dig with, digging through chalk is undoubtedly not much fun. I mean, it wasn't a great deal of fun doing it just with like metal tools and a trowel, but trying to at the end of the pick would have been a bit of a challenge. Then they had gone to the trouble of making this pit perfect, make it round, lovely. Then they had gone and they'd found all the largest flints they could possibly find. Had carved this chalk quernstone, this useless thing, then they'd broken it really carefully, had stuck it in the bottom, and they'd buried it under all this.
And had anyone ever seen anything like that before?
So I was there with Mark Roberts, was leading was one of the lecturers.
Yeah, I did a project with him nearby, right near that spot.
Oh yes, so Mark knows that area very well, and he had never seen anything like that. He'd never seen anything, particularly for Mark. It's quite interesting. It's a very archaeology thing. This I was fascinated by the quernstone.
Yep.
Mark was fascinated by the pit. He was like, I've never seen someone putting this kind of plaster around the outside of a pit. This just doesn't happen in Iron Age pits. So he started phoning up people, and he starts phoning people. He phones people in America, and he says, I've seen it. He's sending them photos. Ever seen anything like this? I go, no. Like, you realise he's reaching out to some of the world experts, which again, it's kind of sobering for you. Like, okay, so he's real because he is Institute of Archaeology, because that is an IOA dig. we can ask the experts at the IOA, but then they have contacts and they reach out to ask their friends and their colleagues and people they've collaborated with over their careers. And then people started coming down to look at this piss of this bloody quernstone.
Yeah, and archaeology, you find, is a pretty small world. People seem to know each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that brings us actually back to the beginning, because although we're not talking about gold and treasure, that's just one of those mysteries, which is something that really draws most people to archaeology. It's like being a historical detective.
Absolutely. As I tell my children, it's like we do seek treasure and we find it, but you have to kind of think about what treasure is, and treasure is something precious. And something which is, like this was 2,500, 3,000 years ago, someone went to all of this trouble, not just one person, probably a lot of people went to a lot of trouble. This was a very precious thing. They did something which was very important and valuable. They put it somewhere which was very precious to them,
Yes.
which was very important to them. And so treasure, and I think that's something you learn as you do archaeology, treasure isn't necessarily jewels, and it can be, well, I mean, for Catholics, treasure can be the finger of a saint,
Yeah.
a little bit of bone. For different cultures and different societies, treasure has different definitions. And I think, you know, it's not just finding coins with a metal detector. And I truly, that was one of the best moments I've had in archaeology, was gently hoiking this thing out of this pit and drawing it and etc. It was great fun. So I'm doing my dissertation on something in that area.
That's some inspiration. Indeed, all that glitters isn't gold, or whatever the expression
nice,
is.
yes.
And believe it or not, the government here has just broadened the definition of treasure, covering things that people find with metal detecting,
Yes, they have.
because there were a lot of things of importance that were slipping through the cracks.
They were. They've changed quite the rules. Really broadened it, actually, I think.
Yep.
All we need to do is make that system a lot more amenable and accessible.
Yes.
It's a particularly complex system. But anyway, I
Anyway,
digress.
So I think we have time for one more topic, because I do
Okay.
want to ask you about something that came up right in the beginning, very hot topic, which was Graham Hancock. Tell me about Graham Hancock. Give me first talk just a brief overview of the books and his HBO special, but then tell me your thoughts.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what the little I know about Graham Hancock. So Graham Hancock was a bit of a nut job, let's say. He basically believed that initially he believed that the pyramids and a lot of monumental architecture around the world had been connected. And his first theory, which may have been somewhat influenced by his quite large consumption of LSD and mushrooms, was that it was aliens who had done so. Anyway, he sobered up. And he put that to one side. And he instead reformulated his theory. And he said that actually, if you look at 600... I'm going to look like a nut job telling you this story, because I know it's not true. But anyway, if you look at around 600 different cultures, they all have a flood myth. So the biblical flood myth. And so some large, huge flooding event occurred, whether it was the breaking of the Bosphorus or the filling of the Mediterranean, who knows? But there was an enormous flooding event. Whether it happened as an acute event or a chronic event, no one knows. But something has happened historically, which enough people around the world have noted and said things flooded. And he said prior to that, so that's around 12,000 years ago, beginning of the Holocene. Prior to that, around 10,000 BC, he said his theory is there was some form of civilization which was drowned, an Atlantean civilization, effectively. And what we see, like the Sphinx, for example, is we see hints of that civilization. So, for example, his evidence is the Sphinx has water marks on it, on the limestone, and is evidently predates the pyramids. The pyramids were put next to the Sphinx because the Sphinx was there. So how old is the Sphinx? No one knows. No one really has any idea how old the Sphinx is. Because you can't date the stone. And there's other examples. He has quite a few of these examples, and he effectively, in a very non-processional, bad scientific way, kind of took a lot of disparate evidence and forced it together. But the nice thing about Graham Hancock is he's got a very compelling way of speaking, and he's got a lovely way of writing. His writing is really very, very compelling, and he loves the monumental architecture which he talks about, and he's got his theory. And his way of making sure his theory is heard by as many people is to create this mythical being, which is the archaeological establishment, and then to counter it. And even though you could put 5 archaeologists in a room and 5 archaeologists would argue about how to open the door because they don't agree about things, because that's the whole point of archaeology, is to interpret and then discuss and challenge interpretation. And so they generally squabble like cats in a bag. He's decided to say the archaeological establishment is this terrible monolithic thing, and it's all against him and his theory. And he kind of ignores the fact that there's actually no evidence really for his theory. I mean, if someone was building monumental structures 12,000 years ago, you'd have some evidence of mines, for example. There aren't any. But anyway, that's by the by. He's got this theory. There's an absence of evidence, and he's very strongly that, you know, that's not an evidence of absence is his kind of position, which is a valid position, I suppose, but not a very valid argument. And he's been producing books. All about kind of with titles, let me think, something of like with heaven or gods or whatever. And very recently he had a documentary series on Netflix which has been extraordinarily successful and has caused many an archaeologist at the Institute of Archaeology to froth gently.
What was the name of this?
Oh, I wish I could remember. What was it? It was, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, for some reason it's escaping me.
It's totally escaped me too.
And
I've watched it all and I thought it was just brilliant. He just showcases these fabulous places and then cobbles his ridiculous theory, or it's not that ridiculous, but it's fairly ridiculous, a ridiculous theory onto it, and then says the archaeology establishment don't believe me. And it's just like, well, yeah, they don't believe you because you've got no evidence, mate. But that's not really the point. But it's in the production values of this thing. It's fabulous. And of course, I mean, it helps. His son-in-law is head of production at Netflix. So that kind of explains, Mr. Hancock Jr., why he might have managed to get the budget to do this. But they didn't scrimp. They really went out and they filmed it. Really high production values.
Yeah, and what I appreciated is they showed some places which are not necessarily kind of household names, Native American sites in the United States.
Yes, for Snake, wasn't it? There was the Snake. And they also have one in the Philippines, which has someone just published on the site in the Philippines. And has caused huge ructions in the world of archaeology, because they've basically said there are several stratigraphic layers of building on this mound. It's a fabulous kind of mound with lots of stones sticking out of it, which they say are deliberately placed. And they've done some kind of deep radar scans. It's either Indonesia or
Indonesia, I believe,
isn't
yes.
it?
Yeah, Indonesia.
And they've done these radar scans of this place. I wish I could remember its name. And he said, you know, there's chambers in there. There's probably voids, which would imply chambers. And then if you keep going down, there would appear to be at a layer, which you can, they've done some core sampling, at a certain layer around 18,000 to 20,000 years ago, there's monumental architecture. And it may well be bedrock, no one's really that sure. But anyway, one of Graham Hancock's affiliates came out and published on this, and it was peer-reviewed, and it was properly published. And the world of archaeology just went absolutely bonkers about it. It was all over Twitter, and it even got into the BBC, I think, about how do they allow this to be peer-reviewed, who reviewed it, who are these peers. But yeah, it's just fascinating that he showed us a site. I'd never heard of a site, and I've been to Indonesia. I'd never heard of a site.
Yeah, I mean, me neither. I've been there quite a bit, and that's something, you know, it was very controversial because first his attack of the quote-unquote establishment, kind of bizarre because usually an establishment is sitting atop of money and or power that they're trying to protect, and there's no money or power in archaeology. So,
I think I'd challenge you. I think there is power.
Well, there's power in the narrative.
There's power in the narrative, and I think there's a certain... No, there is a hierarchical power structure.
Oh, within it. Yes, yes.
But I do think it's also, from an external perspective, there's respect given to it. It does have a certain power. I mean, obviously, it's not got sufficient power to stop HS2, but it certainly has enough power to command HS2 to provide archaeological review. It's backed by people. It's populist power. Because looping right back to what we said at the beginning, people like to understand history and their history, and they feel they have a personal connection to it.
Well, it certainly can be used. Yes, there's some influence in archaeology. It's not probably the most obvious place if you want to be a power broker, but point taken. It's the power of the narrative is very important.
Well, I think this is probably why they're so furious. The establishments were so furious with Graham Hancock, because he's somewhat hijacked the narrative and therefore the populist power, which they see as their right. And actually, he's done that because he's fluent and his production values are good, and he understands what people want to see.
And you know, moreover, that was what I was going to say. Look, I don't agree. Most of us wouldn't agree with what he says in terms of his theory, but he is in the arena and he's speaking to the public. And that's something that archaeologists, I could say a lot of them need to do better. I think a lot of them don't do it, period. You know, for example, I went to the theoretical archaeology group, I guess, convention in Edinburgh last year. That in Britain is probably the biggest, most influential archaeological conference. And I was sitting there in awe. You know, these people, they were just screaming my language, but it was for nerds. It was, you know, boring academic stuff.
Highly academic.
And I was like, people, if you could just talk and make this interesting to, you know, a general public, you guys, you would be Graham Hancock. So people sort of scold him, but he has brought so much attention to the discipline.
Well,
and if he's spouting nonsense, if you don't like what he's saying, then argue with him in the public.
Well, that's exactly it. You have the ability to refute his claims. But just being angry about it doesn't really help. I mean, it is interesting. There are some strong public personas, but we had a lecture recently where the question was asked, why are there no public intellectuals coming from the world of archaeology? I mean, in context of David Ingram, who had just written a book.
He actually was the keynote speaker at Theoretical Archaeology.
So he'd just written a book, and I think he's probably the first with it from the Institute of Archaeology to kind of reach up into that public intellectual space, which is a very woolly space, but nonetheless, it's and what seems to be missing from the understanding of that question in that lecture is the public who choose those people more than, you know, lots of people can put themselves up into a space, lots of people can write, but it's the public who choose to read, it's the public who choose to listen, and I think archaeology sometimes can be a little bit inwardly looking. And wonder why it's a little odd, speaking as someone with a media background, where you kind of look at it and go, it's a little odd sometimes that they seem to be there telling everybody that they can all be great writers, and they can all be this, and everyone should be able to do this. And actually, that's not necessarily true. What they should be doing is recognising the people who are likely to be, and moving them forward, and proactively moving them forward. And perhaps that's not the role of a university. Perhaps the role of a university is to give everybody a fair crack of a whip, in a very egalitarian way. But yeah, it's for the opportunity, provide the opportunities, but very few will kind of be able to take advantage of them.
But I do think in archaeology, maybe not in particular, but in certain disciplines, archaeology being one of them, in academia, there's the kind of this view of talking to the public as an annoyance or something you have to do. And, you know, if you look down on your audience, they're not going to be on your side. And the public does pick you, but you also need to know how to speak to the public. Or the publics, we should say, because there are certainly many niches there. So that's something that I wish more archaeologists did. That's something that I'm trying to do here.
Well, I can see that. And I think there's definitely a desire at UCL within the course to make that a reality. I mean, they have archaeology in the world and public archaeology, and they have specific courses which are mandated, which are about public outreach, about understanding how to do things. And public outreach, as you say, there's lots of different publics, lots of different audiences. You select your audience, you cut your cloth accordingly. So I think it's something which UCL is aware of, but you can't get away from the fact that archaeology is quite an archaic kind of hierarchical structure. It's trying to change, but it's quite a slow change. And it's quite interesting coming from a business which is very dynamic, very gender and ancestrally diverse, into a kind of quite a fusty group of quite a lot of fairly old white men lecturing. And I think that is something which people are actively aware of, which is very positive, and they're trying to change.
Yes, and it's something great at UCL. They have a master's in public archaeology.
They do, yes.
Anyway, I think we're over for time.
Okay, well,
so
hopefully
we'll have to cut it off there. I look forward to seeing you around the hallways and going on another dig.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you very much for inviting me. Hopefully there's some some coherent thoughts within probably quite a lot of gibberish.
Yep.
But no, thank you very much for the opportunity to have a chat with you.
Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.